virtually when it's during the question and answer session in order to pose a question so that we know that you're interested to do so. For those who aren't familiar with MS Teams, you select the little hand that appears in your meeting functions to do so. If those aren't showing, click on the 3 dots that appear on the top right hand of your screen. And for those dialing in, you can press *6 to mute and unmute. Je cède maintenant la parole à l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire Duguid, who will say a few words. Parliamentary Secretary, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tansi. Bonjour. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from my office in Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation here in Winnipeg. And it's my pleasure to join you today on behalf of the Honorable David Lametti, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, along with Vice Chief Edward Leroy of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, to talk about actions our government is taking to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And I know, like so many, I am struggling to find the words to properly express my sadness and shock about the horrific and tragic events at the former Marival Indian Residential School within the Cowessess First Nation. Vice Chief Leroy is a survivor from that First Nation. Attended the ceremony with the Prime Minister and the Premier yesterday, and I really want to thank him for sharing some of his thoughts about yesterday and days gone by. I've really appreciated it. And as we know, this finding is not the first, and we will not see it as the last. There will be similar stories emerging in the days and weeks ahead. Many non-Indigenous Canadians are confronting for the first time the real impacts of shameful, racist, and colonial policies. Our government is committed to listening to the communities directly affected by these tragedies, and we are making sure that any approaches that we take are Indigenous-led, survivor-centric, and culturally sensitive. These discoveries remind us of the impact that colonization continues to have to this day, and they are inspiring much-needed action. They underscore the work we need to do as a country to address the legacy of injustices and to seek ways to create inclusive communities that respect human rights. With today's announcement, we are taking one more step along the difficult journey of reconciliation. This journey involves many travelers coming together to find healing and to forge a better way forward for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. Guiding us along this pathway are the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Many of these calls to action relate to our justice system and the need for fundamental changes to ensure true justice and equality for Indigenous people. Among them is Call to Action 50. CTA 50 calls upon the Government of Canada to collaborate with Indigenous peoples to revitalize their legal systems and to fund Indigenous law institutes for the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous laws in accordance with the unique cultures of Indigenous peoples in Canada. In Budget 2019, we provided $10 million over 5 years in support of Indigenous law initiatives across Canada through the Justice Partnership and Innovation Program. This program aims to improve access to justice and address emerging issues in the Canadian justice system. On May 17th, our government announced funding of almost $9.5 million for 21 projects across the country. And today I'm pleased to support and to highlight funding of almost $500,000 over 3 years to support the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations project to revitalize Indigenous laws of Nahiawak Nation. The project will include interviews with knowledge keepers and elders across Cree communities in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan to gain greater insight into Indigenous laws, practices, and processes. This information will also be used to update the framework for First Nations justice systems, which will help increase communities' understanding and knowledge of Indigenous laws. This, in turn, will reinforce Indigenous traditional values, cultures, and spirituality. We are confident that this funding will help make a real difference for Indigenous communities doing the challenging but important work of revitalizing their legal systems. Today's announcement is one of a number of concrete actions we are taking to advance reconciliation. As I think everyone on the line will know, we recently reached a significant milestone in our work with the royal assent of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act. We now have a roadmap to advance the implementation of the declaration at the federal level. It is our intention that this collaborative work will focus on supporting Indigenous peoples in exercising the right to self-determination. It also speaks to the goals of the CTA 50 and the right of Indigenous peoples to maintain and strengthen their legal distinct institutions. And we continue our work with partners at Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs in negotiations for administration of justice agreements with a number of Indigenous communities. This responds directly to CTA 42 for federal and provincial governments to recognize and implement Aboriginal justice systems. The funding we are discussing today will add to our reconciliation efforts to support Indigenous communities and organizations as they work to revitalize their legal traditions, to build a new path forward that focuses on the needs of diverse people and communities, and to fulfill the promise and potential of reconciliation for all Indigenous people. Thank you, merci, and it's so good to be with you today.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Duguid. Je cède maintenant la parole à Vice Chief Edward Leroy, who will say a few words. Vice Chief, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, sir, and good afternoon to each and every one of you. From Treaty 6 territory, just outside Saskatoon, bring you greetings on behalf of the Federation of Saskatchewan. Indigenous nations, 74 First Nations across the province of Saskatchewan, including 6 treaty areas that run across our province here. We at the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, the collective voice of First Nations in the province of Saskatchewan, are committed to honoring the spirit and intent of treaty, as well as promotion and protection and implementation of the treaty promises that were made more than a century ago. It is our mandate here at the Federation to promote the inherent rights of First Nations people, what we were born with, what creator-given rights we were born with. So as such, the revitalization of our traditional justice practices are important to us. We at the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations are happy to partner with Canada to recognize revitalization of our First Nations justice practices. This to us is part of reconciliation, one part. First Nations in Canada, as you all know, are unique and diverse. In Saskatchewan, we are members of the Cree, Dakota, Dene, Nakota, Lakota, and Saulteaux tribes. Each independent First Nation typically have unique and personal variations of culture and traditional practices. The Truth and Reconciliation of Canada recognized the impact of residential schools had on our communities, and this legacy has harmed our nations and has caused much of our people to lose their language, their culture, their traditions, their identity. The 94 calls to action, we acknowledge, and the partnership supports our communities as we strive for justice systems and practices that meet the needs and challenges faced by our people today. It is recognition from Canada of the Call to Action 50 from the TRC. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted on Thursday, the 13th of September 2007. Today, the Declaration is the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being for our Indigenous peoples of the world, and it elaborates on existing human rights and standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to specific Indigenous groups. As third Vice Chief of our Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, I am responsible for the justice portfolio. Together with our First Nation leaders, we work diligently to describe both the historical context and experiences of an inherent and traditional Indigenous justice system. It is important to integrate traditional justice practices for us into today's society. Keep our roots in our culture and our tradition while adopting to Western the Western civilization process. And it is why this investment continues with our professional people in the universities and the schools, the doctors, the lawyers, and there are many. But there's also a long road to go in terms of those that are suffering from the impacts in the long shadow of residential schools in terms of self-healing. So it's important to integrate this traditional justice practices, as I said, with today's society. We do have a draft document framework for a First Nations justice system, which was drafted in 2013 and responds to 23 separate resolutions passed within our chiefs and assembly that mandate the establishment of a First Nations justice system. The framework states in part, our vision is to create a First Nations justice system that reinforces traditional values, cultures, and importantly, spirituality. Our mission is to strengthen individuals, families, and communities through the restoration of traditional justice. This partnership with Canada will support this continuation of this very important and vital work. We believe that our traditional practices will help our people heal. It has in the past, it will in the future. And it will address some of the current cycles and overrepresentations of our nations as it relates to victimization, criminality, incarceration, systematic racism, and it'll take steps towards the rebuilding of faith and trust in our justice systems. That is fair, our justice system that is fair and responsive to the unique challenges most of our First Nations face on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Vice Chief Leroy. We will now begin the question and answer session. A reminder to please virtually raise your hand to indicate that you would like to ask a question, and to do so by please pressing *6 before asking a question if you're dialing in. Nous allons maintenant amorcer la période de questions et réponses. N'oubliez pas de lever virtuellement la main pour poser une question. Si vous nous suivez par téléphone, veuillez appuyer sur l'étoile 6 avant de poser une question. We will first take questions, if any, from video participants, and then we will go to see if there are any questions on the line. Nous allons d'abord répondre aux questions des participants par vidéo, puis à celles des personnes au téléphone. So if you are interested in posing a question, please raise your hand virtually or signal to us that you are interested. Are there any questions on the line? There doesn't appear to be any questions, so if that is it for today, we can wrap up. I want to thank you very much, Parliamentary Secretary Duguid and Vice Chief Leroy, for participating today. Merci encore d'avoir participé. Si vous avez des questions au sujet de l'annonce faite aujourd'hui, veuillez communiquer avec les relations avec les médias du ministère de la Justice à l'adresse suivante: media@justice.gc.ca. If you have any further questions about today's announcement, please contact the Department of Justice Media Relations at media@justice.gc.ca. Again, thank you very much, both of you, for participating today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Nice to Chief LeBron.